Good morning. My name's John Delaney, and I'm delighted to have been invited to come to the MAME 2014 meeting. I deeply appreciate the invitation from Francisco Curado to invite me to speak to you a little bit today about ways in which ocean and earth activities, ocean and earth sciences are interwoven, and new ways in which we can study those kinds of interweavings in terms of how the overall planet actually functions. So my main point is the title, which is that the understanding of the planetary life support system can be the focus of next generation science in the global ocean basin. I have only 4 major points, and I want to make those fairly quickly to you. The oceans are essential to life on the continents. They are changing rapidly, and they are changing unpredictably. And not only that, but we now have very sophisticated theoretical models of how the oceans work and how the earth and ocean systems work. But they are handicapped in terms of being predictive because we have not been able to feed sufficient data into those models. So that's one of the foci of this conversation with you. The novel technologies that you will hear about and are developing in the marine sciences will rapidly change the way human beings interact with the oceans, and hopefully the time will come when, if we need to manage the oceans, we will be able to do that. Right now we're not able to do that. The system that we're interested in overall is the planet, the entire planet, and it is a huge, huge system, and it's made up of 2 major components. Our main challenge right now is to optimize the benefits and to mitigate the risks of actually living on a planet driven by those 2 energy sources. Those 2 energy sources are, first, solar energy, and solar energy actually drives winds, waves, tides, a host of things, including photosynthesis and basically carbon cycling on the planet. Internal energy is the other major energy source, and that energy source is the cause and the driver for plate tectonics, big earthquakes, large volcanic and small volcanic eruptions, and it also drives chemosynthesis, which we'll talk just a little bit more about. So the major source of chemosynthesis is, in fact, the kinds of chemical reactions set in motion by this internal energy. Now, a third agent, recently important as a result of the changes in the induced as a result of us burning fossil fuels, is the human element. And the human element is basically responsible for altering the Earth's system and essentially making the ocean somewhat vulnerable to processes that are, and stresses and perturbations that are a difficulty for us to deal with at this point. The only way for us to address this rather easily is going to be to gain a clear understanding of how marine ecosystems work. And that is our biggest challenge. And we will not be able to understand marine ecosystems without entering the oceans and beginning to study them from within. Studying the oceans from within is a key element of what I have to talk with you about. And the reason for that is that complexity, the complexity of marine ecosystems is unbelievable. It's probably n factorial, where n it may be maybe 100 plus processes, because all of the processes interact with each other. It's not a matter of having a few processes that may change. They all interact with one another. So when 1 or 2 or 3 change, many of the others begin to shift. And we have to understand that in order to begin to deal with it. So what you're seeing here are the marine ecosystems driven by the solar energy, and what's beneath are portions of the marine ecosystem that are not just affected by solar energy, but are also affected directly by the input of energy from below, and by plate tectonics, and by volcanic activity, and by chemosynthesis driven by the circulation of volcanic fluids and gases. So the system that we're talking about, the ocean that we're talking about, has been around for almost 4+ billion years. Life evolved in this system, we think, and may have evolved in the presence of underwater volcanoes. So this is a very powerful approach we're trying to take, not just to understand the planet we're on and living with today, but the evolution. We're looking at our own origins when we look at how the ocean began to evolve between solar and deep thermal energy. Now, everyone has seen an image like this, and there's a couple things I want to point out. One is that the ocean circulation in this case looks relatively straightforward. It's not. It's really complicated. But I also want to point out the similarity in position between Portugal, and in fact Western Europe, and the west coast of North America. Notice that the arrows on the gyres are, in both cases, the North Pacific gyre and the North Atlantic gyre, are sweeping from the north to the south across the west coast of North America and the west coast of Iberia. So this is important to realize. We have very similar kinds of systems. So much of what I will talk about in my further development here will actually have applications to the kinds of ocean science that goes on off the coast of Iberia or off of Lisbon. Now, the arrows on the previous diagram give the impression of simplicity, but it's anything but simple. Now, the Northern California food web is shown here, and it's anything but simple. It should be very clear that the oceanographic processes that support such a complex food web are unbelievably difficult but to understand, and what you're seeing are the many, many processes, the many, many relationships in this food web that are a challenge to understand, and again, it's only one kind of variable. Another kind of variable that's worth looking at is sea surface temperature. We're looking again at one variable here. It's sea surface temperature, and it's 1 year's worth of data cycling back and forth. This is Northern Hemisphere summer, winter, Northern Hemisphere summer, winter. And what you're seeing are the eddies and the kind of vortex shedding and all sorts of things at the interfaces between the different colors, the contrasting colors. You see that complexity, but the complexity is throughout the entire ocean. It's important to realize that here's only one variable, and yet look how complicated it is. We look even closer near your coast in near Lisbon, where you get a sense of how complicated it is. And you can see, in fact, on the west side of the ocean, the Gulf Stream, which sweeps up across eastern part of North America, and then the eastern boundary current, which sweeps to the south by Iberia. And those are characteristic behaviors in all of the oceans. So the things we're studying in terms of oceanography are really quite powerful. Now, the importance of the oceans is demonstrated by this next video, and I want to show you, this is a cycling video. The time is identified on the lower left-hand corner, and in the color bar to the lower left is red is warm water, surface water of the ocean, and dark blue is cold water. So you're seeing the ocean cycles. They're annual, but there's also an El Nino cycle, which is very clear when there's a strong contrast between red water and blue water in the equatorial Pacific. Look at the continents now. The bright green on the continents is the growth of vegetation on the continents, and the olive green or the brown is dieback of vegetation on the continents. So when you see something like this, you can begin to correlate in time and space the variations in the ocean and the variations on the continents. And this is very, very powerful, very important to keep this in mind, because the ocean, the rhythms of the ocean actually are directly linked to rainfall and drought on the continents. And when the rhythms of the ocean change, like they do in an El Nino year, the growth of vegetation on the continents changes. So this is important, very important for you to realize. The ocean sets the rhythms for life on the continents in terms of food production, because food is a subset of vegetation. Now just take a quick look at the Horn of Africa, just south of the Red Sea, and you will notice that the only time that the Horn of Africa there turns bright green is when there's an El Nino cycle taking place in the equatorial Pacific, which is half a planet away. So there's a rhythm there, and these rhythms are subtle, but they exist everywhere, and we must be aware that the oceans essentially drive the planetary environment at levels that many people who live on the continents don't quite understand. That's one of our challenges. Now, Marcel Proust, the famous French author, wrote many, many things, but one of the things that I like the most is when he said that the real voyage of discovery consists not so much in seeking new landscapes, but in having new sets of eyes. Now, when he was talking about eyes, I don't think he was talking about these. He was talking about our insights. It was metaphorical. But What we really realize is now is it could be literal as well as metaphorical. And let me just develop that point just a little bit. As we look to tomorrow, the number of emergent technologies that can profoundly influence our capacity to operate in the oceans are not developed by oceanographers. They're being developed outside of oceanography with billions and billions of dollars of investment. And when we can come up with creative ways to bring all of those technologies, a few of which I'll talk with you about, into the oceans, we will experience an exponential growth in the capacity of human beings to be present throughout the oceans in order to understand this complexity, this system that we depend upon. So in the top panel there, the power delivery, we will learn more and more and more about how to develop power from the oceans, whether it's wind, waves, tides, currents of various types. We will learn more, and we are learning more about how to develop power, and that's being developed for commercial reasons. In the upper right, robotics, marine robotics particularly, are moving with leaps and bounds, and we're able to operate within the ocean with much more sophistication than we could even 10 years ago. Ecogenomics is the result of the Human Genome Project, and the speed with which we're learning how to operate genomic analyses within the ocean itself is changing exponentially. It's on a kind of a Moore's law curve in that it is rapidly increasing in our capacity to identify and sequence genes in the ocean environment without any human beings nearby. Digital imaging, all of you are familiar with the cell phones and cameras that you have in your pockets, and digital imaging has fundamentally changed the game in ways that are only now becoming evident to the human race. But we have new kinds of cameras and new kinds of communications within the oceans that are allowing us to be present, again, without being there. Fiber optics is the key part of what I have to talk with you about, and then fiber optic cables on the seafloor are on the threshold of changing almost everything in terms of how humans can be present throughout the ocean. You folks know more about cloud and grid computing than I do, and I won't touch on nanotech because that's a 5-day meeting in itself. But all of these capabilities can converge in ocean sciences if we have the right kind of infrastructure, the right kind of capability to develop them quickly, and in the ensemble together they can actually change the way we look at the ocean. Now I'm giving you a preview here of what I'll talk about in just a minute, which is the Ocean Observatory Initiative Regional Scale Nodes Project, which involves instrumenting the Juan de Fuca tectonic plate, which is just off the coast of North America on the west coast. We collaborate with the Neptune Canada folks who have a looped cable, and we have single fibers moving out into the ocean. So we're trying to look at this entire environment, using abundant power present on the cable and unprecedented bandwidth. And this is my main point right here. Delivering unprecedented electrical power and communications bandwidth into the ocean volume can dramatically accelerate the rate of adaptation and scientific innovation focused on what I have come to call our planetary life support system. This is very powerful. Not only is it a new way of doing business, it's a new way of educating, it's a new way of drawing innovative young folks into the study of what we call inner space. Inner space could be just as interesting and much more useful right now than exploring outer space. This is a joke, but you have to have a joke. This is the way people used to study oceanography. This is Francisco Curado's father when he was beginning to study oceanography a long time ago. So this is what the National Science Foundation has put together on the basis of the 4 bullet points I've shown here. Complex oceans, changing rapidly, dangerous and difficult to work in and expensive. And OOI, we feel, can transform the interactions between human beings and the oceans. This is the setup. There are 2 locations in the southern hemisphere, and the locations in the southern hemisphere will involve satellite links to moorings and gliders, buoyancy-driven autonomous underwater vehicles that can, when they come to the surface, can communicate by satellite as well. And in the northern hemisphere, we have 2 of those high-latitude moorings as well, one up by Greenland and one off Station Papa off the west coast of North America. And coastal arrays, the Pioneer Array on the east coast, and the regional scale nodes and the Endurance Array on the west coast. And I'll talk mostly about the box on the west coast. The box on the west coast is the part I know the most about. What you're seeing in this image are some of the locations of observational posts off the west coast of North America. And in this case, it's looking at the climate impacts on marine ecosystems. But there are many, many facets of this, and they would be similar if something existed like this off the coast of Lisbon and or Portugal, in fact, all of Europe. Significant impacts of Pacific decadal oscillations, El Nino and La Nina events, major weather systems that hit North America would be major weather systems that hit Europe. Turbulent mixing sets the tone for ecosystem dynamics, and intense oxygen depletion occurs off of our coast, as well as ocean acidification is accentuated off the coast of North America here. And those are all the things that we're studying in the water column. So what is the Ocean Observatory Initiative, RSN, Regional Scale Nodes Cabled Observatory? What is it planned to do? And that involves using an undersea fiber optic cable. And these have repeater distances up to 10,000 kilometers. They have as many as 8 fibers, and each one of those fiber pair can actually handle 110 gigabit per second wavelengths. This is very, very powerful. And they're powered with a significant amount of electrical power. Here is a quick overview of what we are actually building. You see where Seattle is in Portland. And you can see offshore on the subduction zone, or right on the spreading center where the seafloor pulls apart near axial volcano. The seafloor is pulling apart at about the speed your fingernails grow. And over adjacent to the continental shelf is where the subduction zone is. That's where the plate plunges beneath North America, creating the Cascade Volcanic Range actively. And there are many different environments here for us to study. But what I wanted to tell you then is that we have 900 kilometers of electro-optical fiber. We can deliver 8 kilowatts at each of those red boxes, up to 240 gigabit per second bandwidth, and there are 7 primary nodes that are in place and will be activated within the next few years. The elements consist of a number of key components, and the design facts on the left are that there are 2 major cables, 1 shore landing, a cable station, and 2 major scientific sites over near the continent and off at the far end of the tectonic plate. The primary node is shown here, and I won't repeat what I said earlier, but the primary node is the orange boxes you see in the top diagram. The instruments are attached to what we call a secondary node, and the primary nodes can have 3 or 4 or 5 secondary nodes around each of them, and then each of the secondary nodes, like an octopus, can have instruments associated with it, and all of them communicating in real time and drawing power from the shore. The sensor networks, there are many different kinds of sensor networks, everything from profiling moorings up in the water column to mass spectrometers, to seismometers, to temperature measuring devices, to current measuring devices, all of them working simultaneously. This is one of the interesting aspects for folks interested in the water column. Let me show you how this would work. On the left-hand side, there's a 2-legged mooring, and the 2-legged mooring has a platform that's around 200 meters from below the sea surface, and it can move up and down under control from land. So this is a very powerful addition to the toolbox that oceanographers have. On the right-hand side is another mooring, profiling mooring that can go to the deep sea floor and then back up almost to 200 meters depth. So this is very, very powerful. In concert, we'll have 2 or 3 of these systems offshore working simultaneously. Here is a list for those of you who are really into the specifics. Here is a list of all of the instruments that will be on these systems, and the instruments themselves will be calibrated and they'll deliver data, and we expect sometime early in 2015 to be able to provide insights in terms of what the data flow looks like. Obviously, as in the building phase, we're spending most of this summer and fall putting this system into the water, and we will be offshore Washington, Oregon for about 85 days putting this entire system into the water. What kind of science are we talking about? Well, take a quick look, and this is a quick summary of the kind of science, and I want to share this with you. Simultaneously, this is very important, when you have a ship or you use a satellite, they are tuned to do some specific things. The ship goes out with people on board who study whatever their specialty is, and it goes wherever that specialty is best studied. In this case, we've chosen an area that's 600 kilometers on a side, sort of a box off the coast of Washington, Oregon, and All of these processes and many other processes can actually be studied simultaneously with all the data coming ashore all the time to all the people, because we will be giving the data away immediately upon once it reaches shore, and it comes ashore at the speed of light. So this is a new way of beginning to be present in the ocean without having to be present in the ocean. We will have robots, we will have sensor arrays, we will have convertible systems that we can transition if changes take place offshore, and we can even troubleshoot them very effectively because we have direct high-speed communications to all the systems that are offshore. So here's the kind of thing, just to quickly summarize that for those of you that are seagoing scientists, it's one mesoscale, meaning hundreds of kilometers on a scale, many kinds of interactive science simultaneously, and it's 24/7, 365, and it'll be there for decades. So this is a new next generation way of being in the ocean basins. And all of this activity will take place in real time. Now, a question that you would ask, or I would ask if I were you, would be, what can this system do? What can it become? I've just described to you what it's going to be. Here's what it could become. If we're on the west edge of the tectonic plate, there is a system called axial seamount, which is actually an active volcano underwater, similar to the Azores. And it has a caldera in the middle, a depression in the middle, which is where most of the eruptions take place. The node that you see on the white lines to the west side of the plate are the spreading center where the seafloor is pulling apart, and on top of that is the red box, which is shown there. That red box is also the one that's shown in the inset, the circular inset of axial. And let's go in and look closely at that. Here's axial with the cable. You can see the cable in the lower right-hand corner of that box. You see the junction box there, and then there's another junction box up on top, a primary node. And it's going to be possible eventually for us to instrument this entire volume, 45 kilometers on a side if we choose. This is not in place, this will not be in place in the near term, but the community is talking about, once we've proven that we can do these things, these are the kinds of things that the community wants to do. And we will begin to study the entire volume, day in, day out, year in, year out, for decades. And one of the things we expect to happen after we get all this detailed information together is that this volcano, which is unstable, the seafloor is indeed rising inside that caldera at not just 15 centimeters a year, which it has been rising 15 centimeters a year for the last 15 years. But in the last 2 years, it's begun to rise at 60 centimeters a year. So we think this volcano is going to erupt soon. How do we want to configure to be ready for that? Well, here's a quick look. We're plunging through the surface of the ocean right now, and the kinds of things that could be in place in anticipation of this eruption would be many, many sensors, autonomous vehicles, moored vehicles, sensing devices, all of which can be communicated in near real time about what the conditions are in the overlying ocean, the entire volume of that box. But then the time will come when the volcano is going to erupt. It's erupted twice in the last decade and a half. So we are going to be ready with autonomous vehicles. You can see in the lower left there, right just to the left of the plume, there's a robot vehicle, see it with a little blue scanner beneath it. It has the ability to sense. And then there's another one up in the upper plume near the top part of the plume. And this too is going to be operating, moving through the plume continuously, making measurements of temperature, measurements of particles, measurements of chemistry of the water, and measurements of the microbes that exist in the system, as well as these moorings. So this is very powerful. Whatever your system you're interested in, it might not be a volcano. It might be fish stock assessment, or it might be big earthquakes, or it might be the potential incipient landslide off of some big island. It could be any number of things that you want to study in the ocean of any sort, and here it is available to you. You configure the approach you want to take. Now, I mentioned ecogenomics earlier, and I wanted to sort of share with you this particular vision, and that is one conceived of by Ginger Armbrust, who is on the faculty at the University of Washington. And attached to the cable would be little analytical laboratories about the size of a small trash can. It might be this by this size. And they would have the ability to do genomic analyses When something happens in the ocean, it could be a harmful algal bloom, or it could be whatever it is, could be a volcano erupting, could be anything that's a disturbance. You know it happened because you see the sensors telling you. All of a sudden you turn on the pumps and you pull the fluid into these analytical laboratories that are offshore, nobody nearby, and you hit the button from land and you say, all right, analyze that, and the genomic analyses of the microbes and the phytoplankton, base of the food chain, are actually delivered to you onshore immediately. Then you reset the system and you can do it again. You can do it within arrays. This is very powerful. This is going to change things. Now here's another one. I call this Imagineering. Engineering that's hopefully imaginative. Now the scale of this is probably 200 meters on a side, and these balls are moving. They're robots, and the yellow ones are sensor bots. The red ones are navigation bots, and the green ones are the communication bots, which go back to the cable nearby, and they can communicate with each other at optical bandwidths. So this finds something like a black smoker system, and it begins to organize itself in 3 dimensions, 4 dimensions actually, to look at how this phenomenon changes and what the temperature gradients are, the chemical gradients, the mineralogical gradients, even the microbial gradients throughout this entire system. All the data pass back all the time in real time, and I'm imagining that it would be conveyed on land as holographic projections. And hopefully out of the conference at MEME 2014, there will be people who will model these systems with this abundant data that will flow in real time. This would be very powerful. Another approach we could take would be to have seafloor laboratories, laboratories that are set up for any number of kinds of operations. You remember 2001, the 9/11 event that knocked a few buildings down in New York City? But do you remember 2001, 9/7? Some doctors in New York City removed the gallbladder of a woman who was living in France and was in France. That was 9/7. If they could do that then, and we have this kind of capability in the oceans, imagine the kinds of things we could do biologically, chemically, physically. We could do studies of all sorts in the ocean, on the seafloor, without having to be there or having to bring all the samples back. Now, the cyber infrastructure part of this program is evolving, and it is very challenging, but it will convey all of the activities that are being put together to the community across the world, across the United States and across the world. The global system and the coastal system, I talked to you about. The main one I talked about to you, though, was regional, but all of them will be in place by next year, 2015, and we will initiate marine operations and science operations and cyber operations. So we'll continuously be interacting with the ocean in this volume that is captured by not just the cable, but by the high latitude moorings. We'll be able to modify them as we go. Education, the whole approach to education throughout the nations that can connect to email. You would have classrooms in which students are getting live transmissions from the seafloor and looking at different cameras, say. And they're looking, for instance, here. Let's take an example where the live activity is so good that the students lose sight of the fact that they're actually in a classroom and they think they're on the seafloor. Then we can transition this capability into handheld devices. In fact, we're doing this right now, and it won't be long before you'll be able to examine the output from one of these cabled observatories in real time, virtual real time, within seconds of an event taking place in the ocean. Again, we will be in the ocean, we will study the ocean from within the ocean, and everyone will have access to it at high speeds in real time. This is very, very powerful in my view. And it's the basis for new ways of educating. Imagine what I mentioned to you, holographic projections and students learning in new and different ways. Here's an example of how some students might examine databases that they choose to look at. And this might be 10, 15 years away, and it'll require modelers. It will require some computational capabilities, powerful computers, sensors that are sending data in real time. But there are new ways in which all of us, especially students, but all of us, can conduct our inquiries into what's happening in the global ocean which is the life support system on our planet. So let me just finish with a quick reading by a poet friend of mine who dove to the seafloor with me in the submersible, Alvin. His name is Michael Collier, and I will partially read this, but I'll read it slowly. And I just simply wanted you to understand that we need to merge all of our culture into the study of the oceans. Not just the science side, but the art and the music. And the Portuguese have hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years of being involved with the oceans. I'm looking forward to building close contacts and bonds and collaborations with folks in Europe, but particularly with Portuguese who have such a wonderful history. So this is the poem. 2 miles down the seafloor is a skull, the wounded head of a monster, fractured, faulted, ridged. It won't make me think of Earth as mother or understand Gaia, but that my heart is inside my body and that neutral buoyancy is good. How else can the world be studied? But if life begins in the ocean, it thrives on hot and cold, and the tumble and boil of the sea no longer silent. In Genesis, there's no happiness, only awe and improbability. The hideous is beautiful. Worms 10 feet long, clams the size of frisbees, and shrimp that swarm like insects. And something else, water, burning inside water. Smoking spires and chimneys, and here and there, to calibrate and measure, a weighted buoy, a probe, a camera I'm coming to retrieve. The sonar pings as if it had an ear to my heart. The echo coming back goes through and doesn't stop until it dissipates. A question formed of sound, empty of the shapes it failed to find at the submarine's perimeter of light. Now, at the site of the world's making and unmaking, the way to stay intact is to remain inside the sphere, as if it's a choice I'd made to define myself, but it's no choice. The hatch is held in place, the weight of 300 atmospheres, sky upon sky. There's no courage in this safety, no danger in this passing. The data siphoned, the vents named Godzilla, Hulk, Inferno. My metaphor of monster, the figure of fathom, measuring the depths, holding the unseen dark close, hearing in it the sound of its own shape, a name, and then a creature, an issue, made of what I hold and nothing more. Fathom, the span, fingertip to fingertip, of an embrace. Obrigado.